Well, good morning. Regrettably, the superstars couldn't make it, so Mark and I are just filling in at short notice. Indeed, it is a great occasion for me because, as you know, I'm only allowed out on day release about once a year. Look, today, because Mark's a member of an upper house who are notoriously voluble, I'm basically going to hog the microphone for the whole session. If he gets a word in, he will be very lucky.
Well, I want to get a word in at this point, Ross, and
Okay.
let people know that when we talk about the need for fighting Conservatives and a time for courage, this is my ultimate definition of courage here this morning. Because I think at about 4 a.m, Ross, you've sent me a text message here to say that you weren't sleeping. We won't go into that. But you'd figured out a good way to use our 30 minutes here today, and while you were open to my alternatives, you said, I think you should leave yourself entirely in my hands. And in my own moment of morning insomnia and madness, I texted back, always. So never doubt my courage, folks, I'm here. And Ross, whatever you're talking about, which undoubtedly involve the 15th texts of Marcus Aurelius and such words of wisdom, I'm with you 100%, mate.
Okay, beautiful. I like that. That's what we call the Bill Shorten approach.
Total compliance.
I don't know what she said, but whatever it was, I agree. What's going to happen is I'm going to ask Mark one long-winded question. I'm then going to give you a full-belted rant for about 10 minutes uninterrupted on a very obscure subject. Then I'm going to ask Mark 3 questions. So to begin, when I had my first 4 children on long car rides, you've got to figure out how to occupy. And we would have this game where I would say, okay, you can ask me any question and I'll give you my answer, and then you can tell me if you agree or disagree. So my then 6-year-old number 2 son, Dougal, pipes up from the back. How can Jesus be God? I said, can you give me an easier one? So he said, okay, can people change? And I thought, oh, well, I can't pass on both. I'll have to have a go. And it occurred to me on my way in today that there was actually 3 people who I think are in this room, each of whom have changed in an obvious, material, observable way. And I thought, well, you know, all of us here kind of want to change the world, and pretty much the only way to do it is to change. If everybody changed a little bit, you know, mathematically, would have a big impact. So the first one was yesterday when I had been having Zoom meetings with Andrew Cooper, with Warren Mundine, Steve Baxter, Lyndall, and organising this event, which is not quite the shambles that it could have been. I hadn't seen our chairman, Warren Mundine, for a while, and I caught up with him in the flesh yesterday at lunch, and I looked at him and I thought, well, where is the rest of him? And he explained to me that he had lost 10 kilos. And I said, well, how did you do it? And he said, well, I'm at that stage of life where I've just inherited 2 grandchildren, and I have just fallen so much in love with them, and so much enjoying watching the development of their personality, that I decided I should really try to be present for their weddings. So I lost 10 kilos. I hadn't seen Nigel Farage for 2 years. Then he stepped off the plane at the beginning of last week, and I had exactly the same experience. And I said, well, Nigel, you know, have you got cancer?
Welcome to Australia.
And he said, no, but I've lost 20 pounds. And I said, well, how did you do it? And he said, well, I was in this lockdown. It was going on intermittently. I didn't know how long it would go. So I thought, well, how can I turn this to my advantage? And I went and bought a dog. And I live in the same sort of village that I was born in. and it's got two big hills. So I started setting out each day with the dog. I walked down the hill and up the hill, and I'd turn around, like the grand old Duke of York, and I'd walk down the hill and up the hill, and gradually I found the weight just started falling off. And then I had lunch 2 weeks ago with a mutual friend and Mark Latham at a beautiful restaurant opposite Parliament House. Happily, our mutual friend was paying. And Mark Latham walked in looking like a racehorse.
Okay.
And of course we dived straight into saving civilization. I didn't even have time to ask him how he did it. So I thought you should share, how did you do it?
Well, the first thing, Ross, is to clear away some of the myths. I haven't been suffering from long COVID, mainly for the reason no one suffers from long COVID as a serious medical condition. Long COVID is a mental state for those who've digested too much of the media hysteria about COVID. If you watch too much TV news, you'll probably think the world is ending tomorrow and you'll go with it. So that's not the problem. Unlike Nigel, I haven't got cancer or any suggestion of it. And for any lefties who snuck in here today, no, I'm not dying. News of my departure is much exaggerated. No, I just decided at the beginning of June to get on my 523rd health kick for this decade, and this one worked. I had fruit for breakfast, salad for lunch, steamed vegetables for dinner, and exercise for an hour and a half every day religiously. And if you do that, folks, the weight will fall off you. You'll feel a lot better. And my GP, who had said a few things about niggling health concerns, said, wow, this is really proof of why you should visit your GP, have a checkup. And 2 weeks ago, my blood pressure was 115/65. So your mate at the lunch, in our brief discussion about my weight loss, said that's Tour de France.
Tour de France.
Blood pressure. So how good is that?
Yep, very good.
Oh, well, yeah, racehorse too. I imagine a racehorse in the Tour de France. That's me.
Well, there is actually a race between human beings and horses every year in England. The horse usually wins. The longer the distance, the better the chance the human has. But look, as I was mentioning, Andrew Cooper is actually Warren Mundine's slave, okay? That's the way the relationship works. And
here comes Marcus Aurelius. You can feel it, can't you? The segue from slave to the great man.
Well, if we were going to go slave, we would go Epictetus, who was indeed a slave, but is the most frequently mentioned philosopher in the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. So you had this lovely situation where you have the Greek slave who is educating the chief executive of the world's most powerful empire, which I love.
And that first question, Ross, was?
Yeah. Now I've completely forgotten. Now, my point is Nigel Farage travels with a slave who is Dan Jukes. And Dan is fond of a beer and, in truth, chasing a bit of skirt. He's a single young Englishman. And I think he got to bed at 3 o'clock in the morning, but he's here, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. And he asked me a question last week after we've been travelling for a week. He said, Ross, what is this obsession you have with the ancient world? So the answer to that question is dedicated to Dan Jukes for getting out of bed this morning. Well done, son. And indeed, Marcus Aurelius would say, your job as a human being is not to lie under the doona. The ants don't require instruction to get out of bed and, do the business of a man. But I thought I would bore you for a few minutes with my obsession with the ancient world, but in particular with an introduction to the 7 sages of Greece. And it's an easy, good entry point. Aesop is a beautiful entry point for the ancient world. Indeed, John Stuart Mill's first book he read in Greek was Aesop's Fables. But the 7 sages are a reflection of the fact that the Greek civilization from which we all derive honoured wisdom and learning. And it's very interesting to look at the individuals they chose, the wise men, as sages. And there's, by tradition, 7, but there's different lists. Some have 5, 7, so one has 12, one has 17. But I'm going to stick to 5. Plutarch says that 2 of the 7 were tyrants who paid to get on the list. So we'll stick to 5. 2 of them are well known, 3 of them are more obscure. But I'm going to give you about 1 minute on each. And so you can just relax for a minute, brother.
Well, I like the idea of the 2 who paid to get on the list. Was there lobbyist Michael Photius?
Yeah, it could have been. It could have been.
And were they selling windmills and solar panels?
Batteries. I think it was batteries that got them on the list.
Not pumped hydro or any of these other myths?
No. One of them was a pharmaceutical sales rep. His name was Greg Hunt. But look, the first 2 I want to mention are Pittacus of Mytilene and Bias of Priene. Less well known. They both, all of the sages were not just abstract sort of theorists. They earned their place by doing something, by action, and then they were remembered by a series of maxims, very, very short, which are called laconic after the Lacedaemonians, who are Spartans, who are famous for the brevity of speech. So obviously not me. But Pittacus of Mytilene and Bias of Priene share the characteristic that they each avoided the entanglement of their city in a war. And Pittacus, who was a general, the only one on the list, found himself confronted by an invading Spartan force, a very large force, and he had mobilised the soldiers of Mytilene, and they were gathered on the battlefield. Both sides, hundreds, probably thousands of men with swords drawn, and Pittacus could see a bloodbath. And in a moment of creative genius, he devised an alternative approach. And he went to the general commanding the Spartan troops and he said, look, why don't you and I resolve this in single combat, in a fight to the death, and I will agree that you have won if you kill me, and your troops have to agree that I have won if I kill you. And the Spartan general, you know, recognising a test of his honour and manhood, he accepted the challenge. Pittacus then, as part of his creativity, secreted a net in his shield. And as they approached in between the two armies, he cast the net over the Spartan adversary, immobilised him, plunged through the sword, and won the battle. But in the process, hundreds, indeed thousands of men's lives were saved, and, you know, the wives kept their husband and the kids kept their fathers. And the people, the citizens of Mytilene, were forever grateful. Bias faced an invasion from Persia, and Priene was a small colony on the Ionian coast of now Turkey, and they were totally outnumbered. They were about to get smashed by this massive war machine. He came up with an even more ingenious plan in which nobody got killed, and the Persians negotiated a treaty of friendship. Right. And as we begin this week, you know, someone having bombed a gas pipeline on the eve of a bitterly cold European winter, and at a moment of greater danger than I think I have certainly witnessed in the course of my lifetime, I pray to either the gods of Olympus or the God of Jehovah that we have leaders who can lead us out of wars instead of into them. Look, then we'll go.
I'm liking the idea of this one-on-one battle to save the lives of thousands, and yeah. I'm going to take it up to the New South Wales Parliament and issue that challenge to Matt Keane, my mortal enemy and opponent, who quite rightly won the boo-off last night resoundingly. So I'll take him on, and that'll be over in 5 seconds. Ross, I'll smash him.
I think it's a good idea. I'm sure you could negotiate a truce if you offered a $25 million flagpole. I'm sure That would solve the dispute. Look, the only other... I'm going to draw this to a conclusion, but the point I want to make is that all of us are here... Yeah, fair enough. We're here because we sense the madness around us. Epictetus, going back to the slave, he said we only own 5 things, and one of them is our thoughts. The 7 sages apparently had a meeting together at the Temple of Delphi, and they were asked to inscribe only 2 maxims on the pillar of the temple, and they chose one from Solon and one from Thales, and the one from Solon was know thyself. And we usually attribute that to Socrates, but he was 150 years later quoting Solon. And I just say, no matter how mad the world becomes, Marcus Aurelius would say, we always have the opportunity to retreat into the tranquility of the castle of our own minds. The Greeks give us inspiration. Bias of Priene said that you ought to choose wisdom as the companion from youth to old age, because nothing you possess is more valuable. One of the things that I respect about Mark Latham is he has this insistence that if we are going to effectively combat our adversary, we must be better marshalled of the facts. Our research must be impeccable. And I think the Greeks give us this inspiration where I would just say to you, take advantage of your own mind, adopt wisdom as your companion from youth to old age, ensure that we, on the side of the angels, are better educated, better researched, better informed than the alternative. And in doing so, we'll be following the example of Mark Latham.
Well, that's very kind of you, Ross. And I think the political reality is that the more shallow and superficial the political debate, the more it suits the left. Because they've got their slogans, the restrictions, the boundaries they place on people through cancel culture and political correctness. And we need to break free of those boundaries with evidence-based, heavily researched knowledge. And to use your great mentor, Marcus Aurelius, he was saying that our mind is effectively, in the language of the left, a safe space where you can marshal your thoughts and your arguments. Unfortunately, in today's politics, for too many people, they're allowing their mind to be a permanent trigger warning where they're constantly triggered by this, that and the other thing. I think the beauty of our side of politics really is to be clear-minded about what needs to be done, marshal evidence and facts, and demolish the failings of the left in those key areas of education, energy, economic policy, past failings like the 2,000 boat people who drowned, with the open border policy of the last Labor government. So, you know, the left always fails in these areas, Indigenous affairs, as I mentioned last night. And every week I find that there's always a nugget of evidence-based fact that we should be latching onto that is totally ignored by the mainstream media. If I just give 2 examples from last week, there were 2 figures out there. The ABS released some census data about this question of transgender. They had in the last census a question, do you identify as non-binary? And only 43,000 Australians in the census did that. That's 0.17% of the Australian population. Now listen to the debate from the left about the rights and supposedly the discrimination, the denial of rights to transgender. You'd think it wasn't 0.17%, you'd think it was 17 million, which just shows you how inflated they've allowed that agenda to become in the mainstream media and universities and schools and so on. And the other statistic was that the Auditor-General in New South Wales reported on school attendance, and 57% of Indigenous students in New South Wales don't attend school for at least 90% of the time. 90% of time school attendance is seen as the cut-off point, where if you get over 90, you're most likely getting some beneficial education. 57% of Indigenous students don't reach that essential attendance rate, pointing to Jacinta Price's argument that this is all about, in large part, personal and family responsibility. Send your kids to school. There's no way of breaking the Indigenous poverty cycle unless these children go to school, get good qualifications, a good job, a good career, and move forward. So there are 2 important facts about reality, that transgender is a tiny, tiny fraction of our society, not the inflated 17 million type argument that is perceived in most parts of the leftist media, and that for Indigenous policy, it's not about flags on bridges or The Voice or changing the Constitution. It's about the reality of how you can get kids to school, to use the services, the money and resources supplied by government, take it up to get out of the poverty cycle. So there's just two examples, and these happen every week. And we've got to latch onto those facts, that evidence, and propagate it and spread it as widely as possible, because if we're ignoring those facts, then we're much diminished, and we will be hemmed in by the leftist tactic of restricting what we can do because of political correctness and cancel culture. So I think that's the way forward for us.
Well, one of the maxims of Cleobulus of Lyndon is educate your
I
children.
love all these names. I'm a great fan of the track, and every time I hear these names, I think it's a horse running in the third at Randwick.
And you know, Cleobulus's point.
There's another one.
you can't rely upon the system to educate your child. You must take responsibility to educate them yourself. So I wanted to return to this question with your own story. You know, you weren't born into the greatest opulence and privilege, yet somehow you gained this inner momentum. I wanted to ask you about your relationship with former Prime Minister Gough Whitlam, who was a classical scholar, as I think was his sister, really. But why don't you tell us a little bit about his influence on your mind?
Well, you mentioned my upbringing. I suppose more than Gough Whitlam, my mother gave me my great light bulb moment in life, my flashing point of inspiration. My mother grew up in inner Sydney in Redfern and left school at 14 to go work in a box factory where she met my father. And we moved out to public housing at Green Valley. She says that she was given a choice because they were knocking down our place, a terrace place at Alexandria, to expand the public school that we live next door to. And they said, well, we're moving you to different public housing and you've got a choice of going to Green Valley or Seven Hills up near Blacktown. And they said at Seven Hills there's no sewage, but at Green Valley you won't have an outhouse, you sit on a toilet inside the house. She said that's where we're moving. So because we were fully flushed, I ended up in Green Valley. Went to Ashcroft Public School, so, you know, this is as basic an upbringing and place as you'll ever find. There was nothing green about this valley because they knocked down all the trees, and I think the developer stole all the topsoil and moved it to other locations. So the place was pretty barren. It was mainly clay everywhere. But my great opportunity in life came from good, solid, public schools that taught the basics. We didn't have gender fluidity classes in year 2. We didn't learn about Australia as a horrid, genocidal, misogynistic, homophobic, transphobic nation. We learned literacy, numeracy, basic geography, science, history. And in my household, the key moment was my mother telling me, look, you're studying pretty hard, but the truth is, Mark, I don't know anything about what's in these books other than you've got to do them, okay? This is your one-off opportunity to do what's in these books, to work hard, study hard, and get a better life. And ultimately, I became the first in our family to go to university. At university, I studied the history of the Whitlam government, which put me in contact with Gough Whitlam, who was a former member for Werriwa, where I'd grown up. So that was a nice symmetry and a fantastic opportunity coming out of university to go work for him. He was a classical scholar, Ross, but I've got to say, I've always been sceptical about classical scholars, not so much you, but Gough gave me an insight. He said one day, comrade, I know the Greeks, I know the Romans, but I've got to say to you, what I don't know, I just make up. And the rest of us know so little about these classical ancient civilisations that we're none the wiser if you do make it up. So, you know, Gough was a great man, a very interesting human being, but he did have a touch of bullshit about him.
Well, I will take full advantage. I just want to ask you, I mean, I regard, when you look around, indeed Nigel Farage asked me last week, we're looking at the sort of fragmented, what we might call the libertarian right, the party of reason. We've got, you know, Liberal Democrats, One Nation, we've got United Australia Party, we've got a range of other micro parties, Federation Party. Nigel said to me, well, who is really the leader of the movement. And the truth is, we don't have a simple answer. In my view, the intellectual and leader of the movement is Mark Latham. And, you know, I've tried to persuade him to return to the federal parliament, but he's doing such a terrific job in New South Wales that he can't yet be budged. But I would say if I were to choose the signature issue, I mean, Julia Gillard said she was going to be the Education Prime Minister, and 10 minutes later she was the Mental Health Prime Minister, and 15 minutes later she was the Clinton Foundation Prime Minister. But Mark Latham has actually made education the centrepiece. You're on the coalface. I would love to hear your reflections, you know, both as an MLC but also as a parent to this audience. What have you learnt about moving the dial in terms of the quality of education our kids are receiving in schools?
Well, the fascinating thing in school education is that the evidence base is clear. It's all been studied and researched thousands of times around the world. You wouldn't believe the number of studies into school education. You know, you could pile them up and you couldn't jump over the number of studies. So the facts of it are very clear, what works in a school and what doesn't work. And it's amazing to me that we have any kind of education debate. The evidence is in, the jury is in. Phonics works a hell of a lot better in literacy than whole word. Direct instruction, the old-fashioned idea, increasingly novel these days, that teachers stand at the front of the classroom and actually instruct the students, have a rich interchange of ideas and concepts and knowledge, as opposed to the experimental fad underway in leftist teaching. The teachers are now seeing themselves as facilitators. Students are expected to be self-starting learners, which is code for a group of 5 sit at the table and work on projects, with one kid doing most of the work collecting junk off the internet, while the teacher walks around with a cup of coffee, acting as a facilitator. So that's a losing strategy, And I could go on in terms of curriculum content. We know all the things that work and don't work, and schools need to be based on early literacy phonics, on direct instruction explicitly from teachers, and a curriculum that's about the basics of learning rather than left-wing political junk of various descriptions. So that's the known base, and it's amazing in New South Wales, where we have the fastest falling school academic results in the world, that the Department of Education and the Minister for Education doesn't impose the basics of what works in a school on each and every school. Accidentally, you will find some best practice schools where they've got discipline, they've got order, they've got phonics, they've got direct instruction. They're doing all the things that the research base points to. Why isn't every school like that? Because in New South Wales, in a crazy left-wing experiment under Adrian Piccoli, the former education minister, so this is 8 or 9 years ago, they introduced a policy, the worst in the history of education around the world, called local schools, local decisions, which basically said whatever that school wants to do, we trust the principal and the teachers, and if they want to do experiments and fads and get away from the evidence base and race away with these left-wing theories, they've got the autonomy and power to do that. It was the worst possible time, because in the leftist movement, the takeover of institutions, they were getting away from the evidence base exactly at that time, and Piccoli empowered them to do that. So you've got to bring schools back to a core model of what actually works, what they need to do day to day, and if you achieve that, New South Wales would have the fastest rising academic results in the world. So it's not that hard, and the problem is, in terms of organisation, we've got too many imposters saying that they're mainstream, they're conservatives, they attend to the evidence base. These people in the Liberal and National Party, people like Education Minister Sarah Mitchell, is a complete imposter, because she's really of the left, and they cause us no end of trouble, because they still carry the legitimacy of what voters think Conservative parties used to be, but they're not like that anymore. And I suppose for people on the left who giggle about how your Matt Keens and your Sarah Mitchells have debased the policy framework of the Liberal and National parties, the lefties must think they're sort of Lenin's equivalent of useful idiots, complete imposters who are woke, and they're very much part of the problem that we need to take on. So organisationally, we fight the traditional leftists as well as these newfound former Tory woke leftists. And the other organisational challenge you mentioned, Ross, in terms of leading that campaign, that movement against them, is to unite these micro parties into something significant. If we got all these parties, UAP, One Nation, LDP and so forth together, we'd be guaranteed at least one Senate spot every election around the country, the balance of power in the upper house in Canberra, as well as state parliaments. So the fragmentation of the vote and the division into these various minor parties is very debilitating when we've got such a big job to do in fighting the traditional left, the new left, the corporate left. These are huge tasks and we can't afford to be divided any longer.
Well,
that was my own long-winded answer covering all bases.
Marcus Aurelius says that you should remember always the vast abyss of time on either side of your life. And Thales of Miletus says, concentrate all energy on the current moment. Nigel Farage did over 2,000 community meetings to win the Brexit argument. Mark Latham, as former leader of the Australian Labor Party, could have retired into obscurity and horse racing, but he saddled up. He's here today. I think perhaps now, along with Jacinta Price, he's in a contest for Australia's most valuable Member of Parliament. Pound for pound, he is he's a weight-bearing wall. And I just think if we're going to win this campaign, we've got to get behind those who have put their shoulder to the wheel. Mark Latham is front and centre. So thanks for being here this morning, and let's get behind the intellectual leader of the Australian
thanks, Ross. Thank you very much for those kind words. And thanks for the early morning text message. Remarkably, yet again, it was fine on the day.